It all started with a firefight on a disputed border. Within days, Uganda and South Sudan were rushing their armies to the frontier, pushing two allied nations to the brink of a war that's been simmering for decades. On July 28, 2025, a long-ignored border dispute turned violent, and now the fragile peace is threatening to shatter. But this is not a simple squabble over a line on a map. This is a story of secret political deals, a history of mistrust written in blood, and a hidden power struggle that's turning this remote region into a geopolitical powder keg. This is about the future of East Africa. So, why are these two neighbors suddenly on a collision course? The spark in the powder keg. The flashpoint for this crisis was a deadly clash in the contested border region in Uganda's West Nile, near South Sudan's Kajokeji County. Depending on who you ask in Kampala or Juba, you get two completely different stories. Uganda's military claimed that an armed group set up an illegal camp on their territory and refused to leave. This, they say, forced the Uganda People's Defense Forces, or UPDF, to respond. In the battle that followed, Uganda reported one of its soldiers was killed. Here's where it gets complicated. South Sudan's government denied that its official army was involved at all. In fact, Uganda's own chief of defense forces later clarified that the armed group was actually opposed to the government in Juba. So, Uganda engaged in a major military action against a non-state actor, raising questions about the real motives. Meanwhile, South Sudan accused the UPDF of launching a surprise attack on its sovereign soil, backed by tanks and artillery, killing several of their security officers. This single violent encounter was enough to tear up the diplomatic script. Talk of being sisterly republics was quickly replaced by military hardware rolling to the border. The incident sparked an immediate humanitarian crisis, forcing thousands of civilians to flee the violence with nothing, taking shelter in schools and churches. With armed youth from both sides now patrolling the area, a dangerous security vacuum has emerged, filled with fear and anger. But to really get why this remote borderland is now a geopolitical flashpoint, you have to look at the history, because the seeds of this conflict were planted over a century ago. A century of distrust. The root of the crisis is a line drawn on a map back in 1914. British colonial administrators carved up the boundary between Uganda and Anglo-Egyptian Sudan with little care for the people who actually live there, like the Kuku and Mahdi communities. The language they used was vague, leaving entire regions contested and volatile. When these nations gained their independence, they inherited this colonial mess. For decades, that badly defined border became a front line for proxy wars. Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, was a key supporter of the rebel army that fought for South Sudan's independence. In return, Sudan's government in Khartoum backed the Lord's Resistance Army, a brutal rebel group that terrorized northern Uganda for years. The border became a zone of pure hostility. You'd think the independence of South Sudan in 2011 would have changed all that. And it did, sort of. The two nations became close partners, but that old mistrust never really went away. The UPDF has intervened in South Sudan's internal conflicts multiple times, famously deploying troops during the 2013 civil war to prop up President Salva Kiir. While Kampala called these stabilization missions, they created a messy dependency. Ugandan forces have been accused of acting like they own the place, embedding themselves in South Sudan's security system in a strategy some analysts call militarized clientelism, basically using military muscle to gain political influence. And that has bred deep resentment among South Sudanese who see Uganda's presence not as help, but as a slow-motion takeover. This long, tangled history of colonial lines, proxy wars, and military interventions created the perfect storm. The events of July 28th weren't random. They were the violent eruption of a century of pressure. More than a line on a map. This isn't just a local skirmish. The standoff on the Uganda-South Sudan border has huge implications for all of East Africa, and it all boils down to three things: money, military muscle, and politics. First, the economic stakes are massive. South Sudan is one of Uganda's most important trading partners. Over 150,000 Ugandans do business across the border, in a trade relationship that has been valued at nearly $900 million a year. Uganda sends essentials like cement, flour, and other goods north. A war, or even just a sealed border, would be an economic catastrophe for both sides, cutting a commercial lifeline that supports hundreds of thousands of people. Second, there's the military imbalance. The Ugandan army, the UPDF, is one of the most powerful and experienced in the region. It's fought in Somalia, the DRC, and South Sudan itself. South Sudan's army, on the other hand, is a fractured force worn down by years of civil war. That power gap is dangerous. It might tempt Uganda to go for a quick military victory, but that could easily backfire and drag its powerful army into a messy guerrilla war it can't win. Third, this is all tied up in the internal politics of both countries. For leaders in Kampala and Juba, an external crisis can be a very useful distraction. It's a great way to rally public support and shift focus from problems at home. In South Sudan, a standoff with Uganda could be President Kiir's chance to unite warring factions against a common enemy. And in Uganda, a tough stance on the border plays right into the government's image as the region's tough guy and power broker. Finally, this crisis shows just how weak regional organizations are. The East African community, which is supposed to handle these kinds of disputes, has been silent and ineffective. This failure creates a vacuum, raising the scary possibility that other regional powers could get dragged in, turning this into a much wider conflict. 3 paths forward. As the two armies stare each other down, the region is holding its breath. There are really only 3 ways this can go. The first, and worst-case scenario, is all-out war. If diplomacy fails, one more miscalculation could trigger a full-scale invasion. It would be a humanitarian nightmare. The fighting would spill deep into South Sudan, a country already broken by civil war. Refugees would pour into Uganda and its neighbors, overwhelming them. Regional stability would collapse, and the economic ties holding them together would be destroyed. The second, and maybe most likely path, is a protracted stalemate, a frozen conflict. No declared war, but no peace either. Both countries would keep their armies parked on the border, turning it into a tense, militarized zone where clashes could erupt at any time. Trade would dry up, it would be a slow-burning crisis, poisoning relations for years, and trapping border communities in a permanent state of fear. The third path is a diplomatic solution. It's the best hope, but also the hardest. It would take real political courage from both President Museveni and President Kiir, with serious pressure from the African Union. A real solution means 3 things. Pull the troops back immediately, set up a joint investigation to figure out what really happened on July 28th, and, this is the big one, finally commit to mapping out the entire border, once and for all. It's a chance to turn a source of conflict into a symbol of cooperation. The choice between these 3 futures will define the relationship between Uganda and South Sudan for a generation. It's a choice between war, a cold peace, or a real partnership. What we're looking at is a crisis born from a colonial line drawn a century ago, shaped by a modern history of proxy wars, and fueled by an economic relationship that's both vital and incredibly fragile. The military buildup on the Uganda-South Sudan border isn't just a reaction to a firefight, it's the culmination of decades of unresolved tension. This is a stark reminder that in geopolitics, history is never really in the past, and a simple line on a map can hold the power of life and death. The fate of this borderland has become a test case for the stability of East Africa. The world is watching to see what happens next. Which side do you think holds the leverage in this crisis? Let us know your analysis in the comments below. And if you want to understand the hidden fault lines that shape our world, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell.